Hi everyone, I'm Jack, a radiology trainee based in London. Changing your specialty as a doctor is one of the hardest decisions that you'll ever make. When I was thinking of leaving surgery for radiology, there were a few huge barriers to me taking that leap. These included feeling like it was changing my identity, the sunk cost fallacy, losing the prestige or status of being a surgeon, convincing my family to agree, and starting out as a beginner again, which is something I'm still finding difficult 2 months into my training. In today's video, I'll take you through those barriers to change and how I overcame them, so make sure you stick around to the end. This was probably the biggest hurdle I had to overcome when leaving surgery for radiology. As doctors, we're notorious for making our profession a key part of our identity. On top of that, if you're doing surgical training, you've typically made that decision a few years ago, and you've really internalized that identity of being a surgeon or wanting to be a surgeon. For me, all of my med student friends knew me as that guy who wanted to do ENT, and I even named this YouTube channel ENT Bites as well, originally. All of this meant that when it came to considering leaving surgery, I felt like I was losing a huge part of myself. Looking back, I don't think it's healthy that us doctors see our job as our identity, because that means all of our sense of self-value and self-worth hinges on our job. So if we became unable to work for whatever reason, then we lose a huge part of ourselves. The next biggest challenge in leaving surgery for radiology is something called the sunk cost fallacy. This is when we tend to continue to pursue something because we've already spent time and money on it, even if it's no longer the most beneficial option for us. The reason they call it a fallacy is because the time and money you've already spent can't be regained, and therefore it shouldn't factor into your future decisions. I will caveat that by saying that I don't think you should just immediately quit your job, because there are costs that come with changing jobs. Usually it is easier to stay on the path you're already on. For me, the main sunk costs were in time, money and location. For time, I'd spent 2 years on core surgical training already, as well as countless hours doing surgical audits, projects, and attending courses and conferences. In that time, I definitely spent a couple of £1,000s on courses and exams that I wouldn't get reimbursed. And finally, I'd made some compromises with my location, because in order to get a core surgical training post, I ended up living a little bit further out of my preferred city than I'd hoped, but I tolerated it because it would help me to progress my surgical career. When you consider how much time and money I'd spent on surgery, you'll see how difficult it was to make that decision to leave. If you're even further along in your training, then I can only imagine that the sunk costs would be even greater, and it would seem like an even larger waste to leave that behind. The key thing to overcome this was to think in a more rational way, I suppose, which is that I'd already spent that time and that money on my surgical training so far. If I take where I am now and look to the future, radiology training would mean that I would actually finish training earlier than surgery, even though I start from the first year again. Although staying with surgery would have been easier because I already had some experience there. The third challenge I had with leaving surgery was the idea that I'd be losing the prestige of a career in surgery. Firstly, I will say that I've never considered myself someone who cares a huge amount about status or prestige in my career choices, although I definitely know a few surgical trainees who said if it wasn't for essentially pride, they wouldn't do surgery. However, having said all that, I have noticed the difference in how you're perceived when you say that you do radiology versus surgery. Generally speaking, if you tell people you're a surgeon or a surgical trainee, they think fairly highly of you. If I'm honest, in this country, you're not viewed as highly as, say, in Asia, where you're essentially worshipped. But when you tell people you're a radiology trainee, I think most non-doctors think you're not a doctor. And when you tell other medics, it's slightly viewed as a little bit of a chilled specialty. Let's face it, when I got into surgical training, I'd achieved the Asian dream. If you have Asian parents, then you know exactly what I mean. My family would love telling their friends that I was a surgeon, and then their friends would want to meet you. However, when I told them I wanted to leave to do radiology, it came as a bit of a shock. The arguments against changing are typically the things I've mentioned before, which is that you'd be wasting 2 years and a lot of effort from your surgical training. I think what finally convinced them is seeing me get progressively more burnt out during my surgical training. I'd also mentioned the possibility of a career in radiology to them for about 2 years before I switched, and eventually I was able to bring them around to agree that this was the career I was going to be doing. When making any kind of career change, you'll inevitably have to start a little bit back at the beginning. When I was on my radiology taster weeks, this is what I was told that surgeons find the most difficult about switching to radiology. I actually thought I'd handle it quite well, because I was used to changing specialties every 6 months or so, and essentially being a beginner again. Now that I'm 2 months into my radiology training, I've really started to notice this beginner feeling. Where previously I was able to manage an ENT emergency on call overnight without needing much help, or manage an ENT emergency clinic myself. On radiology, everything I do is double checked by someone else. This is actually very good for training because you get a lot of supervision. And many times I'd be an observer. Mentally as well, this loss of being competent to doing something affects how you perceive your own status as well, I suppose. What tends to come with having some competency within a specialty is being able to teach people. This is something I really miss from my surgical training, which is being able to teach the new team members, such as the foundation doctors. Even when I was doing an intensive care rotation after my surgical training, we had a couple of foundation year doctors who wanted to do surgery, and I remember their eyes lighting up with joy whenever I offered them to stitch in an arterial line. If you haven't already, check out my video on why I left surgery for radiology. That might help you if you're facing a similar dilemma. I'll answer any questions if you leave them in the comments. Like and subscribe if you want to see more videos, and I'll see you next time.